Tonight, President Biden's border overhaul and air security. Federal air marshals threaten to strike over a reported White House plan to divert agents to the border after COVID-era restrictions expire. Plus, new hope for the economy as the Christmas shopping season kicks off, and with the holidays comes flu season.
Here we are again, planning for a surge that will be really hard for us to absorb.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. President Biden's plan for the southern border running into turbulence even before it takes flight. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation from our News Bureau in Washington, D.C. I'm John Jessup. Well, a looming deadline over a pandemic-era policy is drawing attention to the nation's southern border, which has seen a massive spike in migrants in recent months. Along with the expiration of Title 42, which authorized some migrants to be immediately expelled, the Biden administration faces backlash over a plan to deal with the chaos, one that could create another crisis for the nation's airlines. CBN's Tara Mergener has more.
After a long court battle, Title 42 is set to expire on December 21st. President Biden's plan is set to include more resources, technology, and enforcement to help deal with the millions who continue to pour over the southern border. El Paso is among the border communities seeing an unprecedented jump in illegal immigration, with numbers up more than 250% from a year ago.
750 migrants have been released out onto the streets.
Some are simply left to wander the city.
Title 42 and this expulsion to Mexico policy hasn't worked. What we've seen is people who get sent back to Mexico, there's nothing to do in Mexico but try to recross the border again.
Even so, the expectation is that loss of this tool will likely lead to even greater numbers crossing the southern border. So the administration is considering drastic measures, including barring some asylum seekers and more prosecutions of illegal border crossers. Another option could expand legal avenues for migrants and asylum seekers to enter the U.S. Although that choice comes as another crisis appears ready for takeoff. Last month, the administration ordered that air marshals would face indefinite deployment to the border to help with migrant needs, like meals and transportation to hospitals. The Air Marshal National Council says its officers are ready to risk termination and refuse that order.
The message is clearly, let's stop another 9/11. We are extremely concerned.
Because it would mean 99% of commercial flights would have no federal protection.
Air marshals are the first, sort of federal employees to actually stand up to the Biden administration and say, no, we have a law enforcement job we need to do, especially as the American public is traveling on planes for the holiday.
All this as House Republicans gear up for investigations into the administration's handling of the border and a potential impeachment inquiry into Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And President Biden is under scrutiny for not visiting the border.
Is he going to?
So look, he's been there. He's been to the border.
Lawmakers from both sides say they are concerned, signing a letter to Mayorkas, who promises the situation is under control. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Thanks, Tara. President Biden's plan to forgive student loans will remain on hold for now. That was the decision from the Supreme Court today. The justices declined to lift an injunction currently blocking the debt relief program. Instead, it will stay in place until the High Court takes the case up over its legality in February 2023. President Biden's plan would cancel up to $20,000 in debt for millions of people who took out student loans. Challengers say the program is unconstitutional. Well, even as Congress debated the threat of billions, a potential railroad strike would cost the economy weekly, a new report shows consumer spending jumped in October with inflation measures easing somewhat. Today's Commerce Department report shows personal spending rose 0.8%, with new vehicle purchases helping drive that gain. Meanwhile, the rate of inflation in the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index eased by 0.3% from over the previous month. Well, here with us now is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst with Bankrate. Mark, it's always great to have you. Let's start with that report showing consumer spending increasing in October as inflation eased. Mark, what does that mean for the broader economy?
Well, John, always good to be with you. It shows the consumer is very much engaged this holiday season, and sort of the predictions of a demise of the economy by now, I think we're a bit premature. But there are several things about this that concern me, John. Number one is the rate of spending was ahead of the rate of improvement in incomes, and that means that the saving rate has now gone down to a 17-year low. But it's true, even adjusted for inflation, spending on the month was up 0.5%. That's pretty solid.
Mark, the latest jobless claims show a week-over-week decline despite mass layoffs in the tech sector. Tomorrow's November employment report is expected to show slower hiring. Is this a measure the Fed is looking at when it comes to increasing interest rates?
Well, certainly the Federal Reserve believes the job market continues to be almost too robust, and it would point to a report that we got this week as well about more than 10 million job openings in the U.S. There's an incredible mismatch in supply and demand of labor. We know that there are roughly 6 million unemployed in this country. Again, more than 10 million job openings. And as you also note there, John, we have had a series of layoff announcements, particularly in the technology sector, but that has yet to really show up in the sense of either a large number of additional unemployed. We are seeing more people on longer term unemployment bets, the total number of people receiving benefits, but that's still down from a year ago.
Everywhere you turn, Mark, you see these help wanted signs. Shifting gears a little bit here, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell signaled that the central bank will continue with rate hikes next month, rather this month, but at a lower rate. Is that the right move?
Well, we'll see, John. But I think the most important part of this is that the Fed is still intent on raising interest rates to try to combat the number one problem with our economy, and that is inflation that's historically high and has continued, but does seem to have come perhaps off the peak. The Fed will likely raise interest rates by 0.5%, getting its benchmark target range as high as 4.5%. That range is probably headed to 5% or above. It needs to get at or above the rate of inflation. Unfortunately, inflation is still higher than that.
So, Mark, bottom line, what will slowing rates or the rate hikes mean for the average American?
Well, I think the typical person, and I'm an average American, John, just ask my family.
I'd like to say I am too.
The cost of borrowing is set to go higher from here, and that is likely to continue to slow the economy.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. We always appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, my friend.
Well, after mass demonstrations and harsh crackdowns, China is set to announce some easing of the country's strict COVID protocols. Reuters reports the most significant changes, will center on China's quarantine policy, including letting someone who tests positive stay in isolation as opposed to locking down their whole community to avoid an outbreak. Well, joining us now is Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Patrick, welcome to Faith Nation. How do you see the significance of China's easing of the COVID lockdowns?
Well, clearly, Beijing wants to relieve some of the supreme pressure that's driving this nationwide protest movement that threatens the legitimacy and even the survival of Xi Jinping and the party if it really got out of control. So they're not able to lift all the restrictions of the dynamic zero COVID, but they can lift some of them, ease some of the testing requirements, allow some quarantine at home rather than in quarantine centers, and those eases, the easing of restrictions rather, is intended, I think, really just as a safety valve at this point. They cannot afford to open up the country and disband the dynamic zero COVID policy, even though that's what the key official just dropped the word dynamic, because she's referring to the fact that the Omicron variant of COVID is less sort of virulent and lethal. So they're justifying these sort of relaxations, but they're very tentative, and they just cannot afford to do it yet. And the reason for that is because the elderly are just not vaccinated with the RNA vaccine and are not vaccinated in the numbers they need to avoid mass casualties should they really open up.
And we know that their rates of COVID contraction are extremely high. Patrick, even as Chinese authorities do crack down on the protests across the country, what does it say about China's censorship machine that videos of the chants and confrontations are still widely available and visible on the internet in China?
Well, one, it shows that the surveillance state really has trouble tracking all 1.4 billion people, or even if they track them, they can't necessarily stop their communications. The surveillance state continues. The suppression of this and the gathering of information is continued by Beijing. But you're right, the leaking of these sort of Telegram and Instagram and WeChat kind of videos are spreading, and therefore information is permeating China. And I think this is why it's a threat to the CCP, to the Chinese Communist Party. So they're going to crack down on this. They're going to collect information. But at the same time, they want to relieve the pressure that's driving these protests that really could spin out of control.
And we're also seeing, in addition to the videos of the protests, videos of police stopping some of the people in China just to see what's on their phones. Patrick, as you well know, the former Chinese president, Jiang Zemin, who rose to power on the heels of the 1989 pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square, died this week. Under President Xi Jinping and his decade of rule, China has become more oppressive and authoritarian. Will protesters in China latch on to Jiang as a symbol of opposition to Xi's rule?
Well, when you think about just using the blank sheet of paper to demonstrate against the COVID policies, sure, the death of a former leader, Jiang Zemin, even though he was no great reformer, relative to Xi Jinping, he looks like a less sort of, fewer draconian measures were passed during Jiang Zemin's period. And therefore, by contrast, any praise of Jiang Zemin now looks like a threat to Xi Jinping, who was just out of the 20th Party Congress, where he gathered all titles and all power. And yet here he is just a month after that party Congress fighting for legitimacy. So they're going to be very careful. They'll have the flags fly at half staff at embassies and government buildings, until Tuesday when there's a funeral. After that, they'll probably try to clamp down on any kind of praise or information about Jiang Zemin, lest it take away from Xi Jinping's legitimacy.
Patrick, we only have a few seconds left. I want to ask you, there's a new Pentagon report that suggests China is on pace to triple its nuclear warhead stockpiles by 2035, likely fielding a stockpile of about 1,500 warheads by that time. How dangerous is that? How dangerous would China be?
Well, it's a great report. Comprehensive power is growing in China, especially in the military. 1,500 nuclear weapons by next decade would represent that they want essentially parity with the United States. They no longer want a minimum deterrent. It's dangerous, but deterrence still works.
All right, Patrick Cronin with the Hudson Institute, thank you so much for your time and your expertise tonight.
Thank you.
A timeless classic gets a reboot. Coming up, why a new edition of the Book of Virtues 30 years later is more timely than ever. And welcome back. A popular work called The Book of Virtues is getting a revamp. First published in 1993 and selling nearly 3 million copies, the book draws on hundreds of stories and lessons from the Bible, American history, Greek mythology, fiction, and poetry to show children honorable paths to follow. 30 years later, Elaine Glover Bennett joins her husband, Bill Bennett, co-editing a new edition, introducing young readers to more contemporary figures in history, including Mother Teresa, Colin Powell, and heroes of 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan. Well, Elaine Glover Bennett is the wife of Bill Bennett, and she's the co-editor of the Book of Virtues 30th Anniversary Edition. She joins us now. Welcome, Elaine. A lot of changes in the past 30 years, as we all well know. Some would say, though, this book has never been more timely. Elaine, how does the Book of Virtues address today's societal issues, and how does it help children approach them?
Well, we think, first of all, we're very surprised that 30 years ago, this book was embraced to the extent that it was, that there was such a need then for returning to the virtues, understanding what the virtues are, being able to even list the virtues, and to have stories to share with our young people, with our children, as you talk about the teachable moment. you see a child making a wrong decision, and rather than lecturing and saying, don't do this, don't do that, go to a story. There's stories in literature that discuss honor, responsibility, loyalty, and certainly work. And as I guess as our last chapter, most important chapter is faith, because faith is integral to who you are as a human being. And as we used our stories, our sons grew up, they got married, we now have a wonderful grandson. We realized that there needs to be, and frankly, we were delighted Simon & Schuster realized this, a release, a relook at what the virtues are, and a reminder. And we think this book does this. It keeps all the good, solid aspects of it, but we have enriched it, as you said, because things have happened since 1993. We had 9/11. We had heroes for 9/11. We have had heroes in our midst who sadly are no longer with us that our children need to know about. So
Elaine,
heads together.
I wanted to just raise this point. You know, in the 90s, when the book was first written, parents were worried that schools were no longer teaching kids a lot of these qualities: honor, responsibility, loyalty, and hard work. Education is at the forefront again today, 30 years later. Do you think that's even more true today?
Oh, it's absolutely more true. Certainly was needed in the 90s, but we think it's even more needed now. There's education has become confused. Frankly, the woke curriculum is not one that stresses the time-honored virtues. And we know that, we see that. We have our grandchildren who are going to be taking part in that curriculum. We're hoping that the good teachers, and there are many good teachers out there, they've written to us over the years how valuable the Book of Virtues was to them. We've had teachers who created entire curricula around the Book of Virtues. And I think one of the reasons that Bill asked me to come in with this edition as co-editor is because I work so hard on the children's books, the Children's Book of Faith and Heroes, and the Children's Book of America, and the Children's Book of Home and Family. And we incorporated some of those stories, so you can pick up the big book, and you've got stories for middle schoolers, you've got stories for elementary schoolers, but you've also got stories, time-honored stories.
Elaine, I'm so sorry to cut you off. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for being with us. Congratulations on the new edition. Elaine Glover-Bennett, thank you so much. And we'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. The Grinch Who Stole Christmas may be coming in different form this year. New cases of flu, COVID, and respiratory virus are expected to keep rising during the holiday season. The CDC reports high or very high respiratory illness activity in at least 35 states. To top it off, there are 6.2 million flu cases, and new RSV cases are overwhelming children's hospitals in California. Hospitals in Texas are also asking for help dealing with what's dubbed as the triple-demic. CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson shows us ways to stay safe.
14 mostly southern and eastern states are currently experiencing the highest level of flu activity, with many others not far behind. The majority are influenza A, a highly aggressive strain. Hospitalization rates this early in the season haven't been this high since the 2009 swine flu pandemic.
Here we are again, thinking about and planning for a surge that will be really hard for us to absorb over the next couple of months.
And it's not just the flu. Other viruses like RSV, COVID, and the common cold are also spreading nationwide. Doctors say the best overall protection includes vaccination when possible and strengthening the body's immune system.
70 to 80% of your immune system is actually physically located in your gut.
A strong immune system can be traced to higher levels of good bacteria in the intestines, as these organisms can recognize and act when harmful viruses enter the body.
And that results in the release of something called interferons. And interferons are called interferons because they interfere with viruses. And then the interferons are the beginning of this immune cascade, this whole series of events of killer T cells and antibodies that all rush in to protect us from the virus.
Good bacteria are tiny living organisms found in certain beverages and foods like kimchi and yogurt, as well as some probiotic supplements. Once these good bacteria are ingested, it's important to feed them so they grow and multiply. Their favorite food? Fiber.
30 different plant foods per week was a sort of magic number for a healthy microbiome. And so you get credit for fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, seeds, spices, herbs, all of it. I can get 10 different plant foods into a bowl of oatmeal.
And while fiber strengthens the gut, certain medications can harm it. So talk to your doctor about whether you really need certain antibiotics or antacids.
Stomach acid is one of your body's main defenses against viruses. When you ingest a virus, which is a common way for people to get infected, if you have intact levels of stomach acid, it unravels that viral protein and renders it inactive.
So while we may not be able to avoid this season's viruses, we can take action to prevent being derailed by them. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Thanks, Lori. From an NBA game to a global award ceremony. Stay tuned to see what a royal visit in the United States looks like. Next. And finally tonight, the Prince and Princess of Wales made their grand return to the United States. William and Kate kicked off their royal tour in Boston, where they will host the Earthshot Prize Awards on Friday. Hundreds welcomed the royal couple on their three-day visit to Massachusetts, culminating in the Earthshot Prize ceremony, founded by Prince William to award grants to those working in environmentalism. The royals also finding time for some fun on their whirlwind trip, catching a Celtics game on their first day in Boston. Look at Prince William there twirling ball. The tour marks their first trip abroad since Queen Elizabeth's death and the couple's first time in the States in 8 years. And it looks like a lot of fans here as well. Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.